Good evening. My name is James Beebe, and I'm the Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs at Keene State College. Keene State College is the public liberal arts college of the state of New Hampshire, and we take our public mission very seriously indeed, and providing a space for dialogue and deeper learning. So it's my honor to welcome you all to the first ever Kristallnacht lecture, which is presented by the Keene Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. As the first speaker of the evening, I also have the pleasure of reminding those of you in our audience to please silence your phones and any other devices. Thank you. Many of you already know that the Keene Center is marking its 40th anniversary this year, with a special slate of events and programs which includes tonight's lecture. As a public liberal arts institution, Keene State is proud to house one of the nation's oldest Holocaust resource centers. While much has changed in our world since 1983, when Dr. Charles Hillenbrand, founder of the center, and its mission to remember and to teach, the need for public education regarding the Holocaust and other genocides remains ever present, particularly right now. In just a moment, you will hear from the center's current director, Dr. Kate DeConnick, who assumed her role in July of 2022. Dr. DeConnick is trained as an anthropologist of religion with an expertise in religion in the wake of mass atrocities. She holds a doctorate in religion and society from Harvard Divinity School, and her first major research project investigated memorialization and meaning making in post 9/11 New York City. Kate has extensive experience working with survivors, first responders, and others who have been affected by trauma, and she brings that perspective from her work to the role in the center as well. And we're just so honored and happy to have her working with us. It's been a joy. It's one of the best hires I've ever made, I have to say. Not to leave that issue, but it's wonderful. Dr. DeConnick grew up in New Hampshire, but before joining us here in Keene, she worked for 6 years at the University of San Diego, where she taught courses on the Holocaust and related topics in the Department of Religious Studies, and where she also coordinated public-facing events, research, and programs. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kate DeConnick to introduce tonight's event and our featured guest.
Thank you, Dr. Beebe, for the warm welcome to tonight's event. And thank you also to President Treadwell and our other leaders from Keene State College who are present with us this evening as well. Your presence means a lot to us. As Dr. Beebe said, my name is Kate DeConnick, and I'm the director of the Keene Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies here at Keene State College. Since 1983, the center has worked to promote education and remembrance of the Holocaust and other genocides for the purpose of bettering our world today. As James mentioned, this academic year, we're marking our 40th anniversary with a special series of events and programs. In October, many of you were here with us for Dara Horn's lecture, the Holocaust Memorial Lecture. And tonight, I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome all of you to the 2023 Kristallnacht lecture featuring Suzanne Hampel. I want to keep my introduction as short as I can because I know you're all here to hear from Sue, who traveled to be with us from Melbourne, Australia, so we're going to give her as much of the talking time as we can. But first, I did want to remind everyone who's in our audience tonight that we have an e-program for tonight's event. Those of you who are joining us in person have been encouraged to scan the QR code that links to that e-program when you were entering. And for our virtual attendees, that was shared on our slide when you first entered the Zoom room as well. If you did need to pull it up, it's at keene.edu/Kristallnacht program. In terms of the format for tonight's event, Sue is going to speak for about 40 minutes, and then we're going to save the last 10 minutes at the end of the program for questions from our in-person audience. We'll wrap up at 7 p.m., and then the center invites all of you in our audience here with us tonight to join us for coffee, dessert, and informal conversation in the Redfern lobby, right out the doors here. This is the first time that the Keene Center has ever offered a lecture as part of our programming to mark the anniversary of Kristallnacht, the pogrom that erupted in Germany and its incorporated territories in 1938. Many of you in our audience tonight were with us last Thursday, November 9th, when we gathered at the Keene Public Library with partners and leaders from across the state to both remember the events of the past and to recommit ourselves to being a community that resists violence and hatred. We also spoke at length at that event about the recent surge in anti-Semitism across the globe since October 7th. which adds another layer of significance to thinking about Kristallnacht from the perspective of today's world. In September of 2022, Ken Burns and Sarah Botstein joined us and spoke with our community about the US and the Holocaust, helping us to understand how the United States responded at key points in time leading up to and during the Holocaust. Tonight, we have the opportunity to hear from an international scholar and leader, Suzanne Hampel, who will build off that event as well as our 2023 Kristallnacht Remembrance last week, as she delivers her talk, which is entitled Australia's Response to the Holocaust. Parts of Sue's own story are interwoven into the presentation she's giving tonight, but let me try to do at least some justice to her many credentials and her areas of expertise with this introduction. First, Sue is co-president of the Melbourne Holocaust Museum in Australia, an incredible museum that has undergone major renovations over the past 4 years. You'll get to see some images, I think, in your slides tonight of the new spaces in the presentation that Sue will be offering. Sue also holds a master's degree in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, which she earned in 2010, and she's been widely recognized as both a public speaker and a world-class educator. She has received awards for her community service and her contributions to promoting understanding and tolerance. Perhaps chief among these accolades was her being awarded the prestigious Medal of the Order of Australia, OAM. Sue is also the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. Her father was one of 80 family members who were transported to Auschwitz, and he came to be known and affiliated with the Buchenwald Boys, which she'll explain, I think, in some greater detail later. Her mother's family, on the other hand, hailed from Vienna and was one of the lucky few to obtain visas to immigrate to Australia in 1938. Sue is a member of the Australian delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and she served as the international chair of its education working group in 2021. She's also a member of the National Archives of Australia's Advisory Council. And as I think all of you will come to see as you get to know her through her lecture this evening, she is both brilliant and incredibly kind. That's true. We are so lucky to have her with us tonight. So before turning the floor over to Sue, I just want to express my gratitude to the many partners of the Cohen Center who have made tonight's event possible. A full list of those individuals who have either sponsored or otherwise supported tonight's lecture is available in your e-program. And I also want to personally express my gratitude to our ambassador-level sponsors, Ken Burns, Perry Cohen, Rick and Jan Cohen, Kapoloff Insurance Agency, and Rachel Cantor for their commitment to the Cohen Center's mission and work. And in terms of the logistics of tonight's event, a gigantic thanks to Michelle Kiawa, Tom White, Celia Rabinowitz, Pat Wright, and Jeremy Robarge for ensuring a smooth experience for all of our attendees. We also owe a special debt of gratitude to Jan and Rick Cohen. Jan and Rick actually met Sue and Sue's husband, Alex, who's also with us tonight, during a trip to Melbourne, and it was this friendship that sparked the idea to bring them to visit us here in Keene. This story, I think, is also a reminder of how much our chance encounters with others can lead to transformative possibilities for entire communities. And then lastly, please remember that Sue will also be delivering a second public lecture in Keene this week, tomorrow, Wednesday, November 15th. At that time, she'll be speaking about the long campaign for Indigenous rights in Australia at 7 p.m. And this event is co-hosted by the Cohen Center and our friends at Congregation Ahava Sakim. And details and information about how to register can be found in your e-program or on the Cohen Center's webpage, and all of you are welcome to attend. That will also be live streamed. So I would now ask that you join me in welcoming our featured speaker for tonight, Suzanne Hampel, to the stage to deliver the 2023 Kristallnacht lecture. Sue, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that lovely welcome, and thank you for inviting me to be the orator for tonight's talk. As Kate said to you before, I would never have imagined a friendship that started in Australia a number of years ago would result in me speaking tonight. I was fortunate to meet Jan and Rick Cohen when they were touring in Australia, and we discovered a mutual interest in Holocaust and genocide studies. Their vision and philanthropy for the Cohen Centre intersected with what I do at the Melbourne Holocaust Museum and the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. We understand that the lessons of the past will inform and build a better future for the next generation. Thank you, Dr. Kate de Koning, Director of the Cohen Centre for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, for facilitating the very busy schedule of events that have been planned in the coming days. And thank you to the Provost and the President. Thank you very much for your warm welcome. So 40 years ago, Keene State established one of the oldest Holocaust resource centres in the United States. This centre was inspired by the words of Professor Charles Hildebrand, to remember and to teach, to inspire students and other citizens to take responsibility for promoting human dignity and civil responsibility. In these intense and challenging times, your work today is more vital and relevant than ever. Students need to think critically about their role in society and their shared responsibility, and to confront all forms of hatred and promote human dignity. So last week, members of your community here in Keene joined with students and faculty and local leaders in remembering the events that took place on Kristallnacht in 1938, and pledged to be a community that resists this type of violence and hatred. The events that took place 85 years ago marked a turning point in the history of the Holocaust, and we are aware of the echoes and reverberations of history. And as we look at the world today, where hate, discrimination, and anti-Semitism abound, we must ask ourselves the question, have we learned anything from the past 85 years? So in my lecture tonight, I'm going to discuss the impact of Kristallnacht and how Australia responded to the events that were taking place in Nazi Germany and Europe before, during, and after the Second World War. So, here we go. Australia has a long history of accepting migrants to its shores from all over the world. But when it comes to Jewish migration, the story is much more complex, as we will see tonight. Australia is not typically associated with the Holocaust. It is geographically very far from where the systematic decimation of European Jewry took place. But actually, Australia has a very strong connection with Holocaust history. So I'm going to talk briefly about 5 developments tonight. When the Jews first came to Australia, how Australia responded to the rise of Nazism, in particular Kristallnacht, the treatment of wartime refugees, the impact of post-war migration on the Australian Jewish landscape, and Holocaust remembrance in Australia today. So, let's get started. British colonialists came to Australia in 1788 as part of the First Fleet. There were 11 ships with about 1,400 people who established the first European settlements in New South Wales. On these ships were military leaders, sailors, and over 750 convicts who had set sail from Portsmouth in England. The convicts of the First Fleet included British men and women whose crimes ranged from petty theft to assault. Convicts on these ships were sent to 7 years transportation. This was the term for the sending of prisoners to a far-off penal colony. Now, I just wanted to note, and I'm going to come back to this later, that the British government justified the settlement of Australia by calling the land terra nullius. In other words, nobody's land, completely ignoring Australia's Indigenous population who had resided in the country for over 60,000 years. And with the arrival of the British, the Aboriginal people were degraded, robbed of their children, land, culture, massacred, and even wiped out. We'll come to some of that later. So, I'd like you to meet 2 of the early first Jews who came to Australia. There has been a Jewish presence in my country since the beginning of white settlement. Between 8 and 14 of the 751 convicts on the First Fleet were Jewish. An interesting note, I don't know if you know this, but before Australia was colonised by the British, convicts from Britain were sent to America. But your successful American Revolution of 1776 meant that a new home had to be found for the unwanted criminal element, and Australia was the first choice of the British government as a new destination for their transported convicts. So there were Jews on just about every single convict ship until transportation ended. And among the first batch of convicts was this lady here. She was 16-year-old Esther Abrahams. She was convicted of stealing 24 yards of black silk lace from a London store, and she was transported to Australia for a term of 7 years and arrived with her baby daughter in 1788. Now, Esther's quite an iconic figure in Australian history because she was the lover and then the wife of George Johnson, who was the first governor of New South Wales, one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the colony. George Johnson, by the way, has a connection to the United States because before he was sent on the First Fleet, he served with the British forces for 2 years as second lieutenant in the 45th Company of Marines during the Battle of Bunker Hill, not far from here, in the American War of Independence. So the British got around. Esther gave birth to 7 children and was the unofficial First Lady of the colony. Now that's not a bad destiny for a former Jewish convict girl. The vast majority of convicts are 25. There were a lot of famous convicts, but I thought you might like to meet Edward Teddy Davis. He was called the Jew Boy Bushranger. He arrived in Sydney as a convict in 1833. He was 18. He became a leader of a gang of bushrangers, all fugitives from the law. He was the only known Jewish bushranger in Australian history, and he was eventually captured, had a sad ending, he was executed in 1840. But alongside, so altogether about 800 Jews were deported to Australia as convicts until transportation finished, and also came Jewish free settlers. They came as pioneers seeking new life in the 1820s, and this is when the Jewish community started to develop in Australia. And the major influx as well of non-British Europeans came during the gold rush, and also Jews came as well during that time. But the communities in each Australian colony were controlled and dictated to by English-speaking Jews. Each time that they came, they were fiercely loyal to the mother country. So by 1901, Australia's federation, there were about 15,000 Jews who were living in Australia out of a population of 3.8 million. So I teach at Monash University. So this is Sir John Monash. He was born in Melbourne to Jewish parents. He was unbelievably bright. He actually got 4 doctorates, which I think is pretty impressive. And that included from Oxford and Cambridge. When the First World War broke out, he joined the Australian Imperial Forces and fought for the British Empire. He was the Australian Brigade Commander in Gallipoli, Turkey, and by 1918 he was appointed to lead the entire Australian and New Zealand Army Corps on the Western Front in France. He was actually knighted by King George V on the battle roll for his role in the Battle of Hamel Hill in northern France, and many consider him to be the foremost Allied military commander of the First World War. And the second university established in Victoria, my university, was named after him. And he was so popular that his state funeral was attended by 250,000 people. So he's quite a hero. He was pretty well known, but he wasn't the only... I just wanted to tell you before I tell you about this photo, he was not the only member of the Jewish community to make a significant impact in World War I. About 2,000 Jews, or 13% of the Jewish community, enlisted in the Imperial Armed Forces. And in America, I had a look at the statistics so we could compare, about 10% of the Jewish community. So you had 13% of the tiny Jewish community from Australia fighting in World War I, and 10% of the American Jewish community. So I thought that was interesting. And I liked this photo because I was looking at photos. These are Australians and British and American soldiers at a Passover service not long after the war ended. And we have another prominent Jew who was a member of federal parliament, the first Jewish justice of the High Court. This is Sir Isaac Isaacs, knighted for his meritorious services to the nation and appointed as the first Australian-born Governor-General and the first Jewish Governor-General. And why am I telling you about Monash and Isaacs? Because I want to exemplify how this very, very, very small Jewish community, not even 0.5% of the total Australian population, shows us that there was a period of Jewish acceptability in Australian history. So it's so interesting that when you think of the beginnings of the Australian Jews, they felt very, very British. And this was in 1919. We Australian Jews in this remote outpost of the British Empire are Britishers to the backbone and spinal marrow. So the majority of Jews were Anglo-Jews who didn't want to be distinctive and encouraged playing down of any cultural or religious practices. They wanted to blend in. They were fervently loyal to the king and country. And you can imagine how they started to feel when we have immigration starting, firstly with 3,000 Polish and Russian Jews in the early 1920s. And they supported all the government's restrictions on immigration because they didn't want anybody in Australia who would perceive to be different. And so members of the Jewish community supported the system, the quota system. There was a quota system of coming into Australia, and said Australian Jews would be swamped by a sudden eruption of Jews unable to speak English. So these are Jews, don't want too many extra Jews coming in. But by 1933, the population climbed to about 23,000, which was 0.36% of the Australian population. And the Australian Jewish community was decreasing in size because of the high rate of intermarriage. And it was only external events, like the rise of Hitler, which reversed that trend and forced the Jewish community to rethink many of its basic values. So, Hitler becomes Chancellor, you know this history, in 1933, promising to solve the Jewish problem once and for all. And his Nazi policies were designed to make the life for Jews in Germany, later Austria, so difficult they'd be forced to emigrate. And as we know, there were boycotts of Jewish-owned businesses, book burnings, Nuremberg laws, and Jews were officially second-class citizens in Germany, and many Jews planned to leave. Now, the English-speaking countries, and indeed the world, reacted with very mixed responses. So nations were enduring the Great Depression, and following the Wall Street crash of 1929, were in no position to really assist Jewish refugees. Anti-Semitic attitudes in the free world also contributed to opposition to a Jewish refugee migration program. Winston Churchill, he warned of the odious conditions now ruling in Germany and advocated for German Jewish medical and science students to come to the University of Bristol, where he had been Chancellor. But the response was there is no place for students from foreign countries. And Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had been elected in November of 1932, was faced with public fears about immigrants and was not prepared to liberalise immigration policies for Jewish refugees. So what happened in Australia? When Hitler assumed power, Australian Jewry was tiny, isolated, assimilated, right at the edge of the world, at the edge of the diaspora. And in 1924, when the gates to the US were closed, some Eastern European Jews arrived, but Australia had also rigid quotas, and there was no liberalisation of immigration laws until 1936. So this is a picture from Vienna, because once the Nazis took over Vienna in the Anschluss, the persecution of the Jews in Austria outpaced that of the Reich, and Viennese Jews were humiliated and faced violence and looting from Nazi supporters. And as you can see from this photo, hundreds of Austrian Jews made desperate plans to leave, and these ones are waiting in line for exit visas. And this might be familiar, this is from the New York Times. So in response to the increasing number of German and Jewish refugees, Jews seeking to migrate, President Roosevelt convened an international refugee conference in Evian, France. The conference brought together delegates from 32 nations to discuss the rising refugee crisis. This political cartoon is from the New York Times, and its message is clear. Will any country take more Jews? Although disappointing, the conference outcomes were hardly surprising, because it was clear from the outset that none of the participating countries was willing to modify any existing migration restrictions. Colonel White, who was the Federal Minister for Trade and Customs and head of the Australian delegation, bluntly said to the conference that his country was committed to its policy of British migration. He said Australia's intake was comparable to any other nation, and we don't want to, as he said, we have no real racial problem. We are not desirous of importing one by encouraging any scheme of large-scale foreign migration. White was voicing a national sentiment because, according to a public survey at that time, only 17% of the Australian population was in favour of large-scale Jewish immigration. And maybe they thought that refugees would swamp professions or take jobs away from Australians. The Australian historian Paul Bartrop maintains the Evian conference clearly demonstrated that the nations of the world, and particularly Australia, had not yet fully understood the implications of what was happening in Germany. Overall, the conference made little or no progress on the Jewish refugee issue, and as we know, for Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime, the Evian conference was a green light. The reactions of various countries attending made it clear that the world was not prepared to act and to save Jews. So while the Australian government maintained quite a harsh policy toward Jewish refugees, there were a number of Australians who did their utmost to help Jewish refugees. And this is probably one of my favourite Australian stories that I'd like to share with you. So after Germany annexed Austria in 1938, we know the fate of Jews was precarious. So in early 1938, Johann Glaser, you can see him, I highlighted him in the box, he was fishing with his friend Kurt, who had just joined the Austrian Nazi Party. Kurt warns Hans that he's on a Gestapo list of Jews who will be arrested, and he had to leave immediately. But where can he go? Hans remembered his wife Henrietta had a cousin named Bora who had moved to Australia. Hans and his wife wrote to the 6 Boras they could find in the phone book explaining their situation and requesting help. But you won't believe what happened next. The letter did arrive in Melbourne, but it wasn't to Uncle Bora, but to the Bora Pest and White Ant Extermination Company. So this termite company, right? The Bora Company. Where Fred Ashworth, I put his name here, put the name so you can follow, was the director. Now the letter was written in German, and Fred can't read German, so he took it to a dinner party that evening because he knew that the Dacombe sisters spoke German and they could translate the letter. When the sisters read the letter, they decided to become the auntie and uncle Boras and agreed to sponsor the migration of the Glazers and their 9-year-old son to Australia. But time was of the essence. Another guest at the party was Harold Holt. I don't know if you know any Australian history, he becomes famous, Chancellor knows, the Provost knows. Yes, Harold Holt was a young Australian politician who expedited the visas and arranged for the Glazer family to be put at the top of the list of immigration permits. Harold Holt is famous because in 1967, when he is Prime Minister, he's swimming in Portsea and disappears, never to be heard of again. An interesting story we still don't know today. So the Dacombe sisters agreed to be the financial support for the Bora family for 5 years. That's pretty amazing. And it was only on the boat to Australia that Hans Glaser was informed there was no Uncle Bora, but a very generous group of strangers who had secured their passage and safety to Australia. And do you know those Dacombe sisters ended up sponsoring 40 Jews to come to Australia? And the Glazers ended up arriving 2 days before Kristallnacht. Had they been there, 6,000 Jews in Vienna alone were arrested on Kristallnacht and sent to concentration camps. So, Kristallnacht, 85 years ago, the Nazi government coordinated a wave of attacks across Germany and Austria. Over 900 synagogues were burnt through the night, and local firefighters received orders only to intervene to prevent flames from spreading to any nearby buildings. The SA and Hitler Youth shattered shop windows of about 7,500 Jewish-owned commercial establishments and looted their wares. This was very destructive in Berlin and Vienna, the home to the 2 largest Jewish communities in the German Reich. Kristallnacht claimed many Jewish lives. The official figure released by the Germans was 91, but recent scholarship seems to indicate that there were hundreds of deaths. Incarcerated men could only be released if the family could provide very difficult to obtain immigration papers, and the doors of most countries still remain shut. Neither the US or Canada were prepared to increase their immigration quotas. Shanghai was one of the few places in the world which offered a refuge and did not require formal visa. So about 20,000 Austrian Jewish and Czech Jews managed to get there before war broke out. In London House in Australia, there were 50,000 applications to come to Australia. In response to the urgent calls to increase its refugee intake, the Australian government announced it would take 15,000 refugees over 3 years, and as it turned out, only 9,000 got to Australia, including my mother and her parents. So again, I've got another interesting story for you about Australia. So on the 6th of December in 1938, weeks after Kristallnacht, Indigenous leader, remember I told you about the Indigenous people just before, William Cooper, a founder of an Aboriginal rights organisation, read about the brutality of Kristallnacht. Cooper, the son of a Yorta Yorta Aboriginal woman, waited for the international protest, but to his astonishment, there was virtually none. On the morning of the 6th of December, he led a delegation of the Australian Aboriginal League on a march to the German consulate in Melbourne to deliver a petition condemning the cruel persecution of the Jewish people by the Nazi government of Germany. This is amazing. In 1938, the Indigenous people had no rights. They were not even counted in the Australian census. And as I told you, they were marginalised and persecuted by the British and consequential Australian governments. Cooper and his delegation marched to the steps of the German consulate. They were refused entry, but it was one of the very few voices of Australian voices of protest against the Nazi regime's treatment of the Jews. And this exemplary behaviour and courageous stance of William Cooper was in stark contrast to the sentiment and general indifference exhibited by Australia and a lot of other nations at that time. Another interesting scheme is this one, which I really like. So the background is that the political Zionist movement evolved in the late 19th century as a response to the nationalist fervour throughout Europe and in reaction to accelerating anti-Semitism in Poland, Russia and elsewhere. So the ultimate goal was obviously to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And we're talking about, the early 1900s. Daunted by the seemingly insurmountable political obstacles which confronted Zionist idealists, pragmatists believed that the foundation of a Jewish state in a more hospitable and less contested part of the world might be a good objective. Accordingly, at different times, the Jewish Territorial Organisation explored settling Jews in remote areas of Canada, Australia, Argentina, Uganda, and in the 1930s, a number of organisations approached the Australian federal government about the possibility of settling Jewish refugees in underpopulated or unpopulated regions of Australia, partly as a safeguard against an invasion of an unguarded north if hostilities could break out. So you can see where the Kimberleys in northwest Australia. So following that Evian conference, the London-based Free Land League said that they would like to purchase 7 million acres in the East Kimberley region of Western Australia as a farming settlement for about 50,000 German and Austrian Jewish refugees. The project initially won support from the churches and newspapers and some political figures and even some Jewish leaders, but 47% of the public opposed the scheme and Prime Minister Curtin formally rejected the proposal. Another Australian story. With the outbreak of war in September 1939, the escape routes seemed all to be closed to the danger of ships being attacked by the German submarines. So following the British withdrawal from the European continent, more than 70,000 German and Austrians, including any Jewish boys raised over 16 who lived in the UK, were classified as enemy aliens. They were enemies because Britain was at war with their home countries, and they were aliens because they were not born in Britain. So it was thought that these enemy aliens might support Germany and threaten the British war effort. So what did the Brits do? Remember what they did to the convicts back in the 1700s? Well, they shipped them off to the colonies, and a number of enemy aliens were sent to Canada, but about 2,500, including a lot of Jews, mostly Jews, were sent to Australia on board these very overcrowded and under-provisioned ship called the Dunera. The Dunera arrived in Australia in September 1940, and you won't believe it, no one was allowed out. They were all sent to camps, internment camps, in Victoria and in New South Wales. By the end of 1941, most of the internees had been released. Why? Because the British government said it had made a mistake. The internees were not going to pose a threat to Britain or to Australia. And a lot of them ended up volunteering to fight and went back to Europe to fight with the British in the Second World War, and about 900 ended up staying and making Australia their home. They were skilled professionals, tradesmen, doctors, scientists, artists, who made unbelievable contributions to Australian society, including Franz Stamfel, who coached Roger Bannister to the 4-minute mile in 1954. So the war years, unfortunately, saw an increase in anti-Semitic activity in Australia, which flowed from the anti-refugee hysteria of the late 1930s and anti-Semitic organisations like Australia's First Movement, and there was even a small Australian Nazi party. At the end of the war, the Allied troops liberated the camps, the Nazis surrendered. There were over 8 million displaced persons or foreign nationals who needed Allied assistance and care before being repatriated to their nations of origin. So among the displaced persons were about 250,000 Jewish Holocaust survivors. So some liberated Jews made the choice to return to their nations of origin, searching for their family and pre-war homes and communities, and others sought new lives in new nations, hoping for greater safety and better opportunities. So the United Nations established the International Refugee Organisation, the IRO, at the end of 1946, and by the 1950s, nearly all the DPs had moved to the United States, UK, Canada and Australia. 80,000 Jewish DPs went to the US, 136,000 to the newly established State of Israel, and about 17,000 arrived and settled in Australia. And this photo I liked because this was an all Jewish displaced persons camp, originally a summer camp for Hitler Youth. It was located 20 miles southwest of Munich in the American zone, and there were about 4,000 Jews there until it closed, but I liked this picture here. After 1945, there was a fear of influx of Jewish survivors. The fear was fueled by xenophobia and anti-Semitism in a lot of countries. And as noted by Irving Abella and Harold Troper in their study of the Canadian response to the refugee crisis, the Western world was prepared to eulogise the Jews. It was not prepared to offer them a new home. And I'm aware Dara Horn delivered the 2023 Holocaust Memorial Lecture at Keene last month, and she argued that the Western world, the same sort of thing, that they were prepared to eulogise but not to actually give them any place for refuge. So it seems to me that ignorance and indifference has always given rise to hatred towards Jewish citizens, and I would like to think that's changed. So many places, Jews were too often unwelcome, cast as clannish, aggressive, cosmopolitan, and many felt Jewish refugees should get out of their country. So, meet Arthur Calwell. He is Australia's first Minister for Immigration. By 1945, 97% of the people in Australia were either born in Australia or in Britain. That's huge, 97%. This was partly a result of the Immigration Restriction Act, the White Australia policy, and in 1945, when Calwell was made the inaugural Minister of Immigration, he became the chief architect of Australia's post-war immigration, now regarded as the most successful policy initiative of the last century. He circumvented the British bias of the White Australia policy and allowed extra migrants to come in. And the slogan was "Populate or Perish," and that was to help the Australian population accept a large intake of migrants. He understood the need for Australia to embark on the largest immigration program in its history for 3 reasons. Australia was vastly underpopulated, only had 7 million people. Australia was unable to defend itself in case of a further war in the Pacific, thereby felt more vulnerable, and Australia was suffering from shortages in the workforce and required increased labour to meet the demands of a rapidly expanding economy. And as you can see for this quote, if Australians have learned one lesson from the Pacific War, it is surely we cannot continue to hold our island continent for ourselves and our descendants unless we greatly increase our numbers. We are about 7 million people and we hold 3 million square miles of this Earth's surface. Immigration is urgent and imperative if we are to survive. So I'll go to the next one. So in order to convince Australians that immigration was good for Australia, we had a lot of posters. This poster's Today's Migrants, Tomorrow's Australians shows a young man with a cricket bat, as well as 3 people identifying as Dutch and German and Italian. And the posters provided information about the advantage of bringing migrants to Australia. The British people were considered the most desirable candidates But the government soon realised they'd have to source other suitable migrants from European countries. So migrant processing centres were established overseas, and migrants were chosen for their skill and prospects of assimilating into Australia. As you can imagine, many Australians feared new migrants would take their jobs and jeopardise the British-based Australian way of life. So, the Department of Immigration set out to ally these concerns by promoting the merits of migrants, describing them as new Australians or tomorrow's Australians, to suggest they would readily take on Australia's culture and identity and assimilate within 1 or 2 generations, learn English, abandon their own language and culture. And here is another poster. Prime Minister Joseph Chifley at the time approved a recruitment campaign, and there were lots of projects that migrants could apply to come forward. Like there's a famous one called the Snowy Mountains Hydroelectric Scheme, which depended on migrant labour, and you had about 70,000 migrants who were involved in constructing 16 major dams, tunnels, pipelines, power stations. So you have about 2 million migrants coming between 1945 and 1965, which rapidly increased the Australian population. So where does the Jewish story fit into this? So Australian Jewish leaders started to consider post-war Jewish migration to Australia even before the end of the Second World War. Many relatively recent newcomers were deeply moved by the enormity of the destruction of European Jewry and were determined to do everything possible to assist in the rehabilitation of the survivors. An early initiative by Arthur Calwell was to create a humanitarian scheme for Jewish refugees based on family reunions. Calwell was moved by the plight of Holocaust survivors, and his electorate was the Melbourne suburb of Carlton, where a lot of Jewish migrants lived. That's where my mum also lived when she came to Australia. He enjoyed great relations with Jewish leaders, and he approved 2,000 landing permits with those with close relatives of Jewish residents in Australia. And to speed up the handling of applications, I like this story, Calwell accepted an offer of typists from the Executive Council of Australian Jewry. They offered to help. Very clever move there, and they did. In October, Calwell approved the admission of Jewish refugees from Shanghai. The concession was important because, remember I told you about the large number of Jewish refugees who had gone to Shanghai before the war, and they had been ordered to leave. In 1946, he gave more landing permits, and in 1946, Calwell was described as the best friend that the Jewish community has in Australia. Survivors who gained entry saw him as their saviour. But there's always a but, isn't there? So I'll show you a couple of cartoons that were in the Australian press. There was a lot of negative public reaction, and you can get that by just what I told you before about the sentiment. Calwell's program marked a radical break to the migration policy that previously focused obviously on the UK, and opposition was expressed in both state and federal government. It came from trade unions who were worried about the loss of jobs for Australian workers, the RSL, the Returned and Services League. Alarmist headlines and anti-refugee articles and cartoons filled the press. One Liberal member claimed Australia should not be compelled to be a dumping ground for people whom Europe itself, over 2,000 years, has not been able to absorb. Newspapers like the Smiths Weekly also referred to the tensions in Palestine with the British Mandatory Authorities and the terrorist activities of the Stern Gang and the Irgun. And the implication was that Jewish migrants to Australia would be disloyal British subjects. This cartoon in 1946 depicts Calwell as a Moses leading the Jewish people to the Promised Land. You can see Calwell as playing on a flute and, as with the Pied Piper, bringing in the rats, in other words the Jews, with imports, as the imports while pushing out the white Anglo-Celts, or the exports. So in 1948 opinion poll, only 17% of the population approved of Jewish migration to Australia. The negative reaction to post-war Jewish migration was due to a whole lot of different factors. Here's another one. So this is the Sons of the Sea. You can see the caricatures as well. So this is an interesting photo. I'm going to have to go quickly because I'm running out of time. So Calwell actually, in order to appease his political opponents, he decided that only 25% of any boat or any plane coming to Australia was allowed to have Jewish survivors, or Holocaust survivors are Jewish refugees. Only 25%, that was it. And so it was very, very strictly enforced. And how did they enforce it? They asked the question, are you Jewish, on an application form. They could lie about it, of course. That question was only removed in 1953. So, okay, so by 1961, there were 60,000 Jews in Australia, including 35,000 Jewish refugees and Holocaust survivors who found a safe haven, and most embraced their new homeland but reluctant to speak about their experiences. And in this picture is some of the Buchenwald boys. So there was a camp in Buchenwald, in Germany, near Weimar, Buchenwald, and about 1,000 orphans were liberated from there by the Americans on the 11th of April. And my dad was one of these Holocaust survivors. And about 55 ended up making their way to Australia, and they became really, really close. Rabbi Lau, the Chief Rabbi of Israel, former Chief Rabbi Elie Wiesel, the Nobel Prize winner, they were all also Buchenwald boys. And it was amazing because they became like surrogate brothers, sisters, parents to everybody. And every year on the 11th of April, they would have a ball, and they would get dressed up so beautifully in their fanciest clothes and dance the night away. And so that's when their birthday, they had two birthdays, their real birthday and the Buchenwald birthday. So then I'm just going to quickly talk about the Holocaust Museum. So 1984, a group of Holocaust survivors set up the Melbourne Holocaust Museum. It was all in Yiddish. You can see these are sort of, like this is one of the interesting photos. We've actually got the opening next week. I won't be there, but we've got the opening of our new museum. Sydney Jewish Museum, also established by survivors in 1992. That has a Jewish history and a Holocaust museum combined. One of the most amazing things about our Holocaust Museum is giving students the opportunity to actually meet with a Holocaust survivor. We still have about 30, close to 30 Holocaust survivors active at our museum. That's John Lamovi in the museum. You might have heard of Eddie Jaku. He was sensational. He wrote a book called The Happiest Man on Earth. He passed away at the age of 101. He was a key speaker in Sydney. Australia is part, as Kate told you, of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. I'm one of the delegates. That's the new museum that it opened officially last week, and the Prime Minister is going to be opening it very shortly as well. So that's our beautiful new museum. One of the highlights of our new museum is our memorial room. As you look up, it's got this tower, and as you look up, you see that beautiful Star of David. We also have a children's museum called Hidden, and it tells the story of 7 Melbourne Holocaust survivors and how they survived in hiding. And this is just some of the shots from inside, from the museum. And the Holocaust Museum, our whole aim is to continue with the legacy of the Holocaust survivors and tell their story. And this presentation that I had to rush in the end is dedicated to the amazing Melbourne Holocaust survivors, including my father. Thank you. Thank you.
I think it's working. Can you hear me? Perfect. Great. Sue, I think we could have listened to you for much longer. I'm sorry that we're on a limited time for tonight, but thank you for such a compelling presentation. We did want to save some time tonight, though, for questions from our audience. So if you have a question, Celia and I both have mics. We're happy to walk around, take a question. We would just ask that you keep things short, respectful, and that you remember that Sue's not an expert on absolutely everything. Although she's an expert on a lot, so we'll get to that. And we'll just ask you to introduce yourself, please, before you ask the question.
Thank you for your wonderful lecture. I feel like perhaps our ancestors knew each other. My parents are from Vienna, and my aunt and uncle got passage to Melbourne. And I have relatives all over the world, but 2 of those places are New York, where my parents came. And my parents were in Vienna at Kristallnacht, and just barely got out. And my question is, she was able to get an affidavit to the U.S., and she married her friend to save his life. He became her father. How was it that your family specifically was able to get passage to Australia, because that's where my mother's sister, my aunt, went, right in early 1939.
Yeah, it's the same, exactly the same. My mother was actually having her appendix out in Kristallnacht, and her parents, she didn't actually know. I was invited, my mother was invited to Vienna last year to go back. They have a program, the Jewish Welcome Service. They bring survivors back and they pay for everything and look after you. And so I went into the archives office to answer that question. They were just very, very lucky. They found a sponsor in Australia. They were going to go to Argentina. On the sheet that I saw, Argentina had accepted them, and somehow somebody agreed. The Jewish Welfare Service helped. They paid for my grandparents and mother to come, and they somehow managed to find a contact here, over there in Melbourne, and they were very fortunate to come. But through us.
It was just good luck and good timing.
The timing, very lucky. And Australia opened its doors for a very short time, and they managed to come in there. We have a lot of survivors from Vienna in Melbourne.
I also have relatives in New Zealand.
Oh, have to talk.
And Argentina.
The other places. Any other questions? Got more questions?
So I'm interested in a couple of things. One is, I'm Lynn Bergman. I have a relative who left Russia and emigrated to Australia in the, I'm guessing, 1980s. He was a refusenik and tried to get out of Russia for many years after the war, and then emigrated to Australia. And then subsequently went to Israel. But my question is there still Jewish migration to Australia? And also among the Jewish population in Australia, are there Jews, emigrating today, to Israel? So interested in
really good question.
Yeah.
So today it's a thriving Jewish community. About 120,000 Jews live in Australia, still less than 0.5% of the total population. And there was like you said, there was an immigration from Russia during that period, and there was also from South Africa. After the end of apartheid, we had a few coming also from Australia. So there is Jewish migration, but we are very, very Zionist. So we have a lot of people who are making Aliyah. I don't know with the current situation if that's going to make a difference or not. People are talking about moving to Israel, but definitely active Zionists. We have 10 Jewish day schools in Victoria, just in my state, and there are a couple of purely looking at Zionism. We have active youth movements as well. So yes, definitely there are, but it's an amazing, thriving Jewish community in Australia.
Well, thank you for your lecture. I'm Jay Kahn, former vice president here at Keene State, and active in the community. And I share with your other questions, Holocaust survivor parents. They did not seek passage to Australia, though it would have been available. I'm sure they would have done that first, but obviously they arrived in the United States. The question, though, that I have is one that's of current interest. I can't help but not ask it, given today tens of thousands of Jews are gathering in Washington, D.C. To show their support for Israel. At the same time, when we see polls in our country showing that what was initially widespread support beginning to dwindle on all ends of political spectrums, not off the cliff, but of concern to American Jews. And I'm wondering, in Australia, we're about equal distance to Israel. Further away, it seems to be causing people to wonder what is the nature of our involvement in a war that we're associated with. So I'm curious what Australia's newspapers, which I'm sure you've been keeping in touch with, are saying today, a month later, 6 weeks later, out from the initial attack in Israel?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question, and I think it's pretty much similar to what you were just saying about America. I have been very disappointed in the resurgence of global anti-Semitism, and it's impacted definitely in Australia. There was a letter signed by 6 former Prime Ministers a couple of weeks ago deploring the situation, advocating for the return of the hostages, and deploring the anti-Semitism that had started in Australia. There have been a lot of pro-Palestinian protests. In actual fact, the news today was talking about high school students who have decided that they want to have a day of action next week and are calling on other high school students across Victoria to march in protest. Everybody seems to have forgotten about the Hamas attacks, the hostages. There is a lot of awareness about the hostages. A lot of Jewish people have put flyers. I've seen them outside the synagogue here, those sort of posters. But I think it's pretty much similar to what is happening over here in the States. Yeah. And I was going to tell you that my dad actually wanted to go to America. His cousin, he was liberated with his cousin David Zelig, and David managed to get to America, but the family couldn't take 2 of them, so Dad ended up looking somewhere else, and then Australia came up, which was a good thing for me. He arrived in 1949 in Australia. Yeah.
All right, we can squeeze in one more question, Celia, so you have the powerful mic right now.
I didn't know if you're going to keep going past me. So, I'm Rabbi Dan Aronson, and I look forward to hosting you at the synagogue tomorrow night. I wanted to know if you could give us a little preview of your presentation for tomorrow night on Aboriginal rights in Australia, and how is that connected to the Jewish story?
That's a good question. So what I thought was interesting for American people might be to see how we get on with our Indigenous people. And I told you that they had lived here for 60,000 years, lived in Australia, and then the British came and assumed that it was a nobody's land and could take everything. So I'm going to tell you the story of the Indigenous people and how they have been campaigning for a very long time for equal rights in Australia. We just had a referendum last month about whether the Indigenous people should have a voice to Parliament, so I'll be talking about that. And Jewish people have been very much involved in advocacy for our Aboriginal First Nations people. So I'm going to tell you some of the stories of the Jewish people who advocated for them. And it was interesting, while we were having in our Jewish Museum in Melbourne, in our Holocaust Museum, we wanted to explain why we thought that the country people should vote for the referendum that Indigenous people should have a voice. And our Holocaust survivor, Avi Goldberg, who's 99 years old, we celebrated his birthday a couple of weeks ago, he said that Jewish people didn't have a voice in 1938, but one Indigenous leader who had no rights, called William Cooper, spoke and gave us a voice. So now it's our turn of the Jewish people to give the voice to the Indigenous people. So that's what I'm going to be talking about tomorrow night. It's very interesting.
Thank you for encouraging that teaser, Rabbi Dan. What a wonderful transition to tomorrow. We could stay all night, I think, in conversation with Sue, but that was partly why we built in a coffee hour to follow tonight's event. So we hope you're able to join us. We'll have some beverages and desserts in the lobby if you'd like to stay for some informal conversation. Maybe get a little side question in the Sue if you can get a chance to ask something. But let's end just with another round of gratitude and applause for Sue. Thank you.